Bruce Lee was at restaurant when boxing champion said, "Real men have muscle." 8 seconds later. The man telling this story is 83 years old now, and his hands shake when he holds the teacup that sits before him on the scratched surface of his kitchen table. His name is Henry Chen, and for 61 years he carried a secret about what he witnessed on the evening of March 14, 1968, inside a small Cantonese restaurant called Golden Lotus on Melrose Avenue in Los Angeles. He was the assistant manager that night, 22 years old, and among the 17 people who saw what happened when a professional boxer named Danny the Hammer Sullivan walked through the red lacquered door at exactly 8:47 in the evening and made the mistake that would change his life forever. Henry kept silent all these years because Bruce Lee asked him to, looked him directly in the eyes after it was over, and said that some lessons are too dangerous to share before their time. Bruce died 5 years later, and Henry kept his promise anyway, until last month when he learned he had 6 months to live and decided the world had waited long enough. What happened in those 8 seconds revealed more about the nature of power, restraint, and what it truly means to be strong than anything Henry had witnessed before or since. And he spent 6 decades working in gyms, training fighters, and searching for anything that came close to what Bruce Lee demonstrated that night. He never found it. The Golden Lotus occupied a narrow storefront between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy, its windows fogged with steam from the kitchen where Henry's uncle prepared the same 12 dishes they'd served since 1959. The restaurant seated 42 people at tables covered with red vinyl cloths, and the walls displayed faded posters of Hong Kong Harbor alongside cheap landscape paintings in wooden frames. The floor was white tile with black diamonds at the corners, cracked in places where heavy equipment had been dragged across during the initial build-out. The ceiling hung low, barely 7 feet 6 inches, with fluorescent tubes that buzzed constantly and cast everything in harsh white light that made everyone look slightly ill. The air always smelled of ginger, garlic, and the specific type of cooking oil Henry's uncle ordered from Chinatown, a scent that clung to clothing and hair and announced where you'd eaten dinner to anyone who came near you for the rest of the evening. The restaurant attracted a mixed crowd of Chinese immigrants who appreciated authentic preparation alongside white customers seeking what they considered exotic cuisine, and a handful of regulars who came 3 times a week and sat at the same tables and ordered the same meals without consulting menus. Bruce Lee had been coming to the Golden Lotus twice a month since late 1967, always with his wife Linda, or sometimes alone, never with the students who trained at his school on College Street. He preferred the corner booth in the back, positioning himself where he could observe the entire room, with his back protected by 2 walls meeting at 90 degrees. Henry learned quickly that Bruce disliked interruption during meals, that he ate with complete focus, lifting food to his mouth with precise movements and chewing with deliberate attention that suggested he was studying the flavors the way other people studied martial arts forms. He never sent food back, never complained, always left exactly 15% tip calculated to the penny. He wore simple clothing, usually dark slacks and button-down shirts with the sleeves rolled to his forearms, and his physical presence seemed understated until you watched how other people reacted to him. Conversations would pause mid-sentence when he entered the room. Eyes tracked his movement toward his table. Something about the way he carried himself suggested coiled potential, like a spring compressed and waiting. On the night of March 14th, Bruce arrived at 8:15 wearing charcoal slacks and a white short-sleeved shirt, and he carried a leather notebook under his arm that Henry later learned contained observations about training principles and philosophical questions Bruce explored between teaching sessions. Linda wasn't with him that evening. Bruce ordered hot and sour soup, kung pao chicken, and steamed rice, and he sat in his usual booth reading his notebook while waiting for the food. The restaurant held 11 customers scattered across 6 tables, including a Chinese family of 5 celebrating their grandmother's 78th birthday, 2 white couples who appeared to be on first dates based on their nervous conversation patterns, and an older man Henry recognized as a regular who came Thursdays and Saturdays and always ordered the same beef chow mein. The kitchen sounds provided steady background rhythm, woks clanging against burners, water running, Henry's uncle shouting instructions in Cantonese to the prep cook whose name was Tommy Wong and who'd worked there since the restaurant opened. Danny Sullivan entered at 8:47, and Henry noticed him immediately because the man commanded attention the way certain people do, not through effort, but through sheer physical presence that seemed to compress the air around him. Sullivan stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 238 pounds of muscle built through 15 years of professional boxing that included 43 wins, 11 losses, and 2 draws in a career that peaked in 1964 when he fought for the middleweight championship and lost in the 9th round to a Cuban fighter whose name Henry can no longer recall. Sullivan's face showed the evidence of his profession, scar tissue ridging his eyebrows, his nose broken and reset at least twice, leaving it slightly crooked, his knuckles enlarged and misshapen from thousands of impacts against heavy bags and human faces. He wore a tight-fitting polo shirt that displayed his upper body development, arms thick as normal men's thighs, shoulders that seemed to enter rooms before the rest of him, chest that strained against fabric with each breath. His hair was cropped short, military style, and his jaw carried the square, solid look of someone who'd taken punches and kept standing. Sullivan walked with the specific swagger of men whose bodies had won them respect in arenas where physical dominance decided outcomes. His eyes swept the restaurant with assessment that seemed automatic, cataloging threats and measuring opponents. And when his gaze passed over Bruce Lee sitting in the corner booth, something shifted in his expression that Henry would recognize years later as the look predators get when they spot prey they consider inferior. Sullivan took a table near the center of the dining room, 4 tables away from Bruce's corner position, and he sat with his back to the door in a position that suggested either supreme confidence or obliviousness to the tactical disadvantage. He ordered without looking at the menu, pointing at items with thick fingers while telling Henry's uncle, who had come out to take his order personally, that he wanted real food, not that tiny portion bullshit they serve at those fancy places. His voice carried across the restaurant, pitched loud enough that everyone could hear, though whether this was intentional display or simply how he spoke remained unclear. The food arrived for both men within minutes of each other, steam rising from white plates arranged on red vinyl tablecloths, and for 15 minutes nothing remarkable occurred beyond the ordinary consumption of meals in a public dining establishment. Bruce ate with his characteristic focus, attention directed completely at his food and his notebook where he occasionally wrote observations between bites. Sullivan ate with aggressive efficiency, forking food into his mouth with movements that suggested eating was a necessary fuel intake rather than pleasure experience, and twice he called Henry over to request more water, draining full glasses in 4 continuous swallows that showcased his throat working like mechanical pump. The restaurant's other customers continued their own conversations. The family sang quietly to the grandmother while presenting a cake Henry's uncle had prepared. The couples held hands across tables. The regular ate his beef chow mein while reading a newspaper folded to the sports section. What happened next began so subtly that Henry almost missed it, and only his position near the kitchen door, where he'd been standing folding napkins and observing the dining room, allowed him to witness the initial trigger. Sullivan had finished his meal and pushed his plate forward, and his attention drifted around the room with the restless energy of someone whose body demanded constant stimulation. His gaze settled on Bruce Lee, and Henry watched Sullivan's expression cycle through recognition, assessment, and something that looked uncomfortably close to contempt. Sullivan stared for perhaps 30 seconds, long enough that several other customers noticed, and glanced between the boxer and Bruce Lee, wondering if conflict was developing. Bruce continued eating, apparently unaware of the attention, though Henry suspected even then that Bruce missed nothing, that his peripheral awareness operated at levels normal people couldn't access. Sullivan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against tile with a sound that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise. He picked up his water glass, still half full, and walked toward Bruce Lee's corner booth with deliberate strides that seemed designed to demonstrate he wasn't trying to hide his approach. He stopped beside Bruce's table, standing at an angle that forced Bruce to turn his head to acknowledge him, a positioning that established dominance through requiring the seated person to look upward. Sullivan drank from his water glass, throat working, eyes never leaving Bruce, and when he lowered the glass, he spoke in a voice pitched to carry to every table in the restaurant. He said, "You're that kung fu guy, right? The one teaching that dancing around nonsense instead of real fighting." Bruce Lee set down his chopsticks with care, aligning them parallel to the edge of his plate with movements so controlled they seemed choreographed. He looked up at Sullivan, and Henry saw Bruce's face transform from the blank absorption of eating to alert presence that somehow suggested he'd been waiting for this moment, perhaps even expecting it. Bruce's voice, when he responded, carried none of Sullivan's aggressive volume, pitched instead at conversational level that forced people to quiet themselves to hear. He said, "I teach martial arts. Whether that qualifies as real fighting depends on how you define reality." The answer seemed designed to deflect rather than escalate, offering philosophical redirection instead instead of defending his methods or returning the implied insult. Sullivan laughed, a sound without genuine humor, and he shook his head with exaggerated disbelief. He said, "Reality? I'll tell you about reality, friend. Reality is getting hit in the face by a 200-pound man who knows how to throw a punch. Reality is standing in a ring with nowhere to run and someone trying to knock you unconscious. That dancing around, touching each other's hands, wearing silk pajamas and calling it fighting, that's fantasy. That's for people who never stepped into real combat." His free hand gestured dismissively, encompassing Bruce and by extension everything Bruce represented, and several customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats while the Chinese family gathered their belongings and prepared to leave despite cake remaining on their table. Henry moved closer, not yet sure whether intervention would be necessary, but positioning himself where he could respond if violence erupted. Bruce remained seated, and his stillness seemed to create a pool of calm in contrast to Sullivan's agitated energy. He said, "You're right that getting hit is real, but limiting reality to only what you've experienced is like describing the ocean after standing on the beach. There's depth you haven't touched." The words carried no heat, no defensiveness, stated as simple observation rather than challenge, and this seemed to frustrate Sullivan more than anger would have. Sullivan wanted confrontation, wanted the other man to rise and defend himself, to match aggression with aggression and justify the escalation Sullivan seemed to crave. Bruce's refusal to engage on those terms left Sullivan momentarily uncertain how to proceed. Sullivan set his water glass on Bruce's table without asking permission, a territorial gesture claiming space in Bruce's domain. He leaned forward, hands flat on the vinyl tablecloth, bringing his face closer to Bruce's eye level, though still maintaining height advantage. His voice dropped lower, more intimate, which somehow made the words feel more threatening than when he'd been projecting to the room. He said, "You want to know what I think? I think you're scared. I think all that philosophy and internal energy and mysterious Eastern wisdom is cover for the fact that you couldn't take a real punch from a real fighter. I think you teach movie fighting to Hollywood pretty boys because, if you stepped in a ring with someone who actually knew how to hurt people, you'd fold like a cheap tent." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. All conversation ceased, customers frozen in place, watching the confrontation unfold. The only sounds were the kitchen noises continuing obliviously behind the swinging door and the fluorescent light's constant buzz overhead. Bruce Lee's expression didn't change, didn't register anger or offense, and Henry thought later that this might have been what pushed Sullivan past the point where he could extract himself gracefully from the situation. Bruce said, "What would convince you otherwise? If I told you I've been in street fights, you'd say they weren't real because no rules governed them. If I told you I've trained boxers, you'd say I never competed myself. You've decided what truth is, and nothing I say will change that. So why are we talking?" The question seemed to catch Sullivan off balance, and his face flushed darker red that Henry recognized from years of watching fighters as the color of someone whose pride had been challenged. Sullivan straightened from his leaning position, standing to full height, and his chest expanded with a breath that seemed to make him physically larger. He said, "We're talking because real men have muscle. Real men develop their bodies into weapons. You're what, 5'7", maybe 140 pounds soaking wet? You'd look like a strong wind could knock you over. Meanwhile, I've been building strength my whole life. This," and he flexed his right arm, the bicep swelling grotesquely large. "This is what real power looks like, not your internal energy nonsense, or your speed you can't even see. Raw strength. The ability to break bones and destroy anyone who gets in your way." Bruce Lee's response came after a pause that lasted exactly 7 seconds. Henry counted them, and when Bruce spoke, his voice carried a quality Henry had never heard before, something between sorrow and steel. He said, "Real men have understanding. Muscle is just meat that responds to stimulus. But since you've convinced yourself otherwise, and since you won't leave me alone until you've proved your point, I'll make you an offer. I'll give you one free strike, anywhere you want, however hard you want. Then you'll sit down, eat dessert, my treat, and never speak to me again. Or what happens next will teach you something your boxing career apparently didn't." Sullivan's laugh exploded from him, loud and genuine this time, and he looked around the restaurant at the captive audience watching the exchange. He said, "You're giving me a free shot? You're serious? Jesus Christ, you really are insane. Fine. Yeah, I accept. One punch, wherever I want, however hard I want. And when you wake up from the hospital stay, you can tell your movie star students what happens when fantasy meets reality." He rolled his shoulders, loosening them, and his neck cracked audibly as he twisted it side to side in preparation. Bruce stood from the booth, movements flowing like water, and when he reached his full height, the size difference seemed even more dramatic than when he'd been seated. Sullivan towered over him, outweighed him by nearly 100 pounds, and Henry thought of every David and Goliath story ever told, and wondered if this time the ending would be different. Bruce stepped away from the booth, moving toward the center of the dining room, where the tables had been pushed back slightly by customers retreating to the walls, creating an impromptu arena roughly 15 feet by 12 feet. The tile floor reflected the harsh fluorescent light, and Henry could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, alongside the ragged breathing of the other customers who'd remained to witness whatever came next. Bruce positioned himself in the center of the open space, hands hanging loosely at his sides, weight distributed evenly between both feet, and his face showed nothing beyond neutral awareness. He looked at Sullivan and said, "Whenever you're ready, one strike, make it count." Sullivan stepped forward, rolling his shoulders again, and he took a boxer's stance instinctively, left foot forward, right foot back, hands rising into guard position before he seemed to remember he'd been given free shot and didn't need to protect himself. He lowered his hands, still clenched into fists, and circled Bruce slowly, evaluating angles and potential targets. Henry could see Sullivan's mind working, considering whether to aim for the head and risk killing the smaller man, or choose the body and demonstrate dominance without potential murder charges. Sullivan settled on body shot, stepping in closer, and his right hand drew back like a piston, compressing before explosive release. The telegraph seemed obvious to Henry, the enormous wind-up sacrificing speed for power, but Bruce didn't move, didn't flinch, simply stood watching Sullivan's fist accelerate toward his solar plexus with force that could break ribs or rupture organs. What happened in the next 8 seconds would require 3 pages to describe adequately, because those 8 seconds contained more action, more revelation, more transformation than most people experience in years of ordinary time. Sullivan's fist traveled the distance between full extension and Bruce Lee's body, and in the milliseconds before impact, Bruce's torso rotated precisely 43 degrees to the left, while his right hand rose in an arc that intersected Sullivan's incoming forearm at the exact point where muscle met bone. The collision made a sound like baseball bat striking heavy bag, meaty and solid, and Sullivan's punch continued forward, but now traveled 6 inches to the right of where it had been aimed, missing Bruce's body entirely, and creating momentum Sullivan couldn't control. Bruce's left hand, moving in sequence so perfect it looked choreographed despite being improvised response, pressed against Sullivan's elbow from the outside, adding force in the direction Sullivan was already moving and amplifying his imbalance. Sullivan's forward momentum, originally directed at destroying Bruce, now carried him past Bruce's position, and his own power worked against him as he stumbled 3 steps forward before catching himself. Time 0.8 seconds. Sullivan regained balance and spun back toward Bruce, and his face showed confusion that hadn't yet processed into anger, because the speed of what had just occurred exceeded his ability to analyze while in motion. He saw Bruce standing in the same spot where he'd been when Sullivan threw the punch, as if nothing had happened, and Sullivan's boxer's brain tried to reconcile how a strike with 340 pounds of force behind it had missed a stationary target by 6 inches. Sullivan's hands came up automatically into guard position, and this time there was no theatrical gesture, only trained response to threat, his body recognized even if his conscious mind hadn't yet understood. Bruce remained still, and his voice when he spoke carried almost gentle quality, like teacher correcting student's form rather than opponent gloating about defense. He said, "You committed fully. Never do that unless you're certain. Certainty is how fighters die." Time 2.1 seconds. Sullivan stepped forward again, this time with boxer's jab instead of wild power punch, and his left hand snapped toward Bruce's face with textbook form, shoulder rotating, hip driving, fist traveling straight line from guard position to target. The punch moved fast, far faster than the first attempt, covering distance in time Henry's eyes couldn't quite track. Bruce's head moved, not a dodge or duck, but minimal displacement, shifting 3 inches to the right while his upper body rotated, and Sullivan's fist passed through empty air where Bruce's jaw had been 1/20th of a second earlier. Bruce's right hand rose simultaneously, fingers extended rather than fist clenched, and his fingertips brushed against Sullivan's extended arm just below the elbow, not striking but guiding, redirecting Sullivan's momentum once again, so the boxer's own force carried him forward in direction he hadn't chosen. Sullivan threw a right cross immediately following the jab, textbook combination, and Bruce's left forearm rose to intercept, but instead of blocking solid like Sullivan expected, Bruce's arm rolled around Sullivan's incoming punch, spiral motion that absorbed energy energy and redirected it in circular path that left Sullivan punching at angle that exposed his ribs. Time 3.7 seconds. Bruce's right hand, which had been guiding Sullivan's left arm, suddenly shifted from defense to offense in transition, so smooth Henry almost missed it, and Bruce's palm struck Sullivan's exposed ribs with impact that sounded like someone slapping wet leather. The strike traveled perhaps 6 inches from starting position to contact point, minimal distance, and looked gentle enough that several customers later said they thought Bruce had pulled the attack entirely. Sullivan's reaction revealed otherwise. His entire body convulsed, right side collapsing inward protectively, and his face contorted with pain expression that transformed his features from aggressive confidence to shocked disbelief. The ribs hadn't broken, Henry learned later when Sullivan went to emergency room for x-rays that showed deep tissue bruising but no fractures. But the pain was comprehensive enough that Sullivan's breathing pattern changed immediately, becoming shallow and guarded, each inhale carefully measured to avoid expanding damaged area. Time 4.9 seconds. Sullivan, operating now on instinct and pain-driven rage rather than strategy, launched wild overhand right that sacrificed all technical form for raw power, putting everything remaining of his strength into punch, aimed at Bruce's head with enough force to kill if it landed. Bruce didn't step back or dodge, instead moved forward and to the side, inside Sullivan's arc of motion, and suddenly Bruce was closer than fighting distance allowed, pressed against Sullivan's body where the boxer's long reach advantage meant nothing. Bruce's left forearm pressed against Sullivan's chest while his right hand reached over Sullivan's extended arm, and in motion, that happened too quickly for Henry to fully comprehend. Bruce's hand touched the side of Sullivan's neck, fingertips pressing against pressure point where carotid artery branched, and Sullivan's eyes went wide as his blood pressure suddenly plummeted from the pressure. Bruce's other hand simultaneously pushed against Sullivan's chest, and the combined actions, reduced blood flow to brain plus backwards force against upper body, sent Sullivan stumbling backwards, legs suddenly unstable, vision darkening at the edges. Time 6.2 seconds. Sullivan caught himself against the edge of a table, hand gripping vinyl tablecloth, and his survival instincts screamed at him to retreat, to create distance, to escape the smaller man who had somehow dismantled his attack, with efforts that seemed minimal compared to Sullivan's maximum output. But Sullivan's pride and years of training where retreat meant defeat kept him moving forward, kept him throwing punches, and he launched desperate combination, left hook to body, followed by right uppercut, both strikes powered by panic rather than technique. Bruce's response demonstrated principle he would later explain in his notebook, the concept that economy of motion determines efficiency of force. Bruce's hands moved in small circles, not blocking Sullivan's punches, but deflecting them, each contact lasting fraction of second, just enough touch to alter trajectory by inches that accumulated into feet of distance between Sullivan's fists and Bruce's body. Bruce's footwork created angles that made Sullivan's attacks miss their intended targets, while simultaneously positioning Bruce where Sullivan's defenses were weakest. Time 7.1 seconds. Sullivan, exhausted now from the explosive output and the pain radiating from his damaged ribs, threw one final punch, right straight aimed at Bruce's face with last remaining power in his arm. Bruce's left hand rose and caught Sullivan's wrist mid-extension, not grabbing tightly, but wrapping around with grip that seemed almost gentle. Bruce pulled Sullivan's arm forward while stepping to the side, using Sullivan's own momentum again, and Sullivan found himself stumbling forward off balance, his body position completely compromised. Bruce's right hand, formed into knife edge rather than fist, moved towards Sullivan's throat, traveling 6 inches with speed that created blur, and stopped with the edge of Bruce's hand pressed against Sullivan's windpipe, with pressure just sufficient to restrict breathing but not damage tissue. Bruce held the position for exactly 1.3 seconds, long enough for Sullivan to understand that if Bruce had completed the strike instead of stopping it, Sullivan's throat would have been crushed, his ability to breathe eliminated, his death occurring within minutes from asphyxiation or blood loss if the strike had been angled slightly differently to tear the carotid artery. Time 8.4 seconds. Bruce withdrew his hand and stepped back, creating 3 feet of distance between himself and Sullivan, and his expression showed no triumph, no satisfaction, only careful assessment of whether the lesson had been received or whether additional demonstration would be necessary. Sullivan stood frozen, one hand reflexively touching his throat where Bruce's strike had stopped, and his face cycled through expressions so quickly Henry could barely identify them before they changed to something else. Shock, disbelief, fear, recognition, and finally something that looked almost like relief, as if Sullivan had been waiting his entire career for someone to show him that what he'd believed about power and strength and combat was incomplete understanding rather than fundamental truth. Sullivan's legs gave out, not from injury but from the combined physical exhaustion and psychological impact, and he sat down heavily on the tile floor, back against the table he'd caught himself on earlier, and his breathing came in ragged gasps, while his eyes remained fixed on Bruce Lee standing 3 feet away.